The story of the Old West is written in blood and dust. It's a tale of pioneers, outlaws, and lawmen, all carving out a life under a merciless sun. But there's one question that echoes across the plains, whispered around campfires and in the smoky corners of saloons. Who was the last true gunslinger? We know the names that became legends: Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Wild Bill Hickok. Men who lived fast, died young, and whose stories became bigger than their lives. But this isn't their story. This is the story of a man who never wanted to be a legend. A man who just wanted to be forgotten. A man named Elias the Ghost Thorne. Elias wasn't born into a life of violence. It was a trade he learned, a ghost he wore, and a life he desperately tried to shed. He found refuge in Redemption Creek, a town so small and quiet it barely existed on a map. He took up the humble trade of blacksmith, his calloused hands now shaping iron instead of gripping steel. The townsfolk knew him simply as Elias, a quiet, stoic man with a haunted look in his eyes. He lived in the shadow of his past, a past that included being one of the fastest draws the West had ever known. But the ghost was dead, or so he thought. The peace of Redemption Creek was shattered by the arrival of a new kind of evil. A gang led by Silas, the Snake, Calloway, a man as vile as his name suggests. Silas and his men were a plague, leaving a trail of fear and destruction in their wake. They weren't after gold or fame. They were looking for something specific, and they were convinced Elias held the key. It was more than a confrontation. It was a ghost from Elias's past come back to haunt him. Silas knew who Elias was. He knew about the ghost, and he knew about Elias's brother, David. The arrival of Calloway's gang wasn't just a threat to the town. It was a reopening of old wounds, a forcing of Elias to confront the tragedy that had made him swear off the gun for good. The quiet streets of Redemption Creek were now a stage, and Elias Thorne, the reluctant hero, was forced to play a role he had long since abandoned. The question wasn't if he would have to fight, but at what cost. The tension in Redemption Creek was a palpable thing, a hot, oppressive weight in the air. Silas Calloway, with his sneering grin and cold eyes, had made his intentions clear. He wanted the map, the one he claimed Elias's brother, David, had hidden. Elias refused to even acknowledge the claim, clinging to his quiet life, his vow. "I'm a blacksmith, Calloway," he said, his voice low and steady. "I have no map." Calloway just laughed, a sound like dry leaves scraping on a tombstone. "The ghost is a coward," he spat, then turned and left, his gang leaving a wake of chaos in their path. They vandalized the general store, tipped over a water barrel, and shot out a window of the saloon, a casual display of power meant to rattle the town and, more importantly, rattle Elias. But Elias stood firm. His hands, though trembling slightly, kept hammering on the anvil. He was a man of routine, a man who believed that if he just kept his head down, the past couldn't find him. This was the lesson he'd learned at a terrible cost, a lesson etched in his mind as vividly as the scar above his eye. He was in the middle of a job, mending a plow for a farmer named Old Man Jenkins, a kind soul who'd always believed in him. "Don't you mind them, Elias," Jenkins said, his voice soft. "They'll move on." Elias didn't answer. He knew they wouldn't. Calloway was a snake, and snakes don't move on until they've sunk their fangs in. A sharp noise, a sudden memory, pulled him back. He was no longer in the dusty blacksmith shop. He was back in the canyons, the air thick with gun smoke. Flashback: Elias and David, brothers not just by blood but by their shared life on the run. David, older, faster, and more reckless, was a legend in the making. He was the one who loved the thrill, who saw every gunfight as a test of honor. Elias, the younger brother, was always the one trying to talk him out of trouble, to just walk away. One night, they were camped in the high desert. David was working on a small, brass compass, a gift for Elias. "This ain't just for finding your way, little brother," David had said, his voice full of a hard-earned wisdom. "It's for knowing where you're headed, not just where you've been." The memory was cut short by a sound that snapped Elias back to the present, a woman's terrified scream. Calloway and his gang had a little girl, the daughter of Elias's friend, held at gunpoint in the town square. "I'm tired of games, blacksmith," Calloway shouted, his voice echoing across the now silent streets. "Give me the map or the girl gets it." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the girl's tear-streaked face, a face so full of pure, innocent fear. He saw in her eyes a reflection of his own past, of a moment of hesitation that had cost him his brother. He thought back to that moment, a flashback so painful it felt like a fresh wound. Flashback the ambush. Calloway, a former associate, had set them up. He and his men had ambushed Elias and David at a small, secluded campsite. "Where's the map?" Calloway had snarled. David, wounded, had only laughed. "There's no map, Silas. There's never been a map." Calloway, fueled by rage, had fired a final, fatal shot. David had fallen, the small brass compass falling from his hand. Elias had been too slow. He had a moment of hesitation, a split second of disbelief, and in that second his brother was gone. He had fled, a ghost in the night, with only the compass as a reminder of his failure. Back in the present, the little girl's fear was the final blow. The oath he'd made to David, the one that had kept him from the gun, felt like a chain, not a promise. He looked at his hands, the hands of a blacksmith, and then at the rusted revolver hidden beneath his bed. He took it out, the cold metal a familiar weight. He cleaned it, the rhythmic motion of the cloth against the steel a silent prayer. He loaded each bullet with a grim finality. The ghost was back. He wasn't doing this for fame or for vengeance. He was doing this because there was no other choice. He was doing it for Redemption Creek, for the little girl, and most importantly, for David. He had to finish what he had started. He had to face his past, not as a coward running from a ghost, but as a man embracing the part of him that was truly alive. And so, he walked out of his shop, the sun setting behind him, casting a long, dark shadow, the shadow of a man who was no longer running. He was heading towards the bluff, towards Calloway, towards his destiny. Elias stood on the high bluff, the wind whipping at his coat, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and red. Below, Calloway and his men were waiting, a coiled snake ready to strike. The final confrontation was swift and brutal. Elias, no longer the weary blacksmith, moved with the speed and precision of the ghost. He picked off Calloway's men one by one, using the terrain to his advantage, his every move a calculated and deadly dance. Finally, only Calloway remained, his face a mask of furious desperation. "You're just a ghost from the past, Thorn." Calloway snarled, his hand hovering over his holster. "The West doesn't need your kind anymore." "Maybe not," Elias replied, his voice calm, "but it still needs a man to face the snakes." The moment was a blur of motion. Calloway drew first, a flash of steel, but Elias was faster. The shot rang out, and Calloway fell, a look of shock and disbelief on his face. As he lay dying, he spat out one last truth. "That compass. David gave it to you. It was never a map. I just told you that. I just wanted to get even for that horse. Elias stood over him, the gun still smoking. The truth was a bitter pill. His brother hadn't died for a legendary map, but for a pointless, petty conflict. The guilt that had haunted Elias for years, the belief that his brother's obsession with a treasure map had led to his death, was a lie, a poison Silas had used to manipulate him. The weight on Elias's soul didn't lift, it simply changed. He hadn't been too slow to save a gunslinger obsessed with a map. He had been too slow to save his brother from a greedy coward. Elias returned to Redemption Creek. The townspeople cheered, calling him their savior, their hero. But he didn't stop to celebrate. He simply walked through the crowd, past the grateful faces, and headed toward the outskirts of town. He walked until he reached the small, unmarked grave of his brother. He knelt, taking out the compass. The inscription on the back, faded but still legible, read, "Elias, don't run from who you are, embrace it." He placed the compass on the grave, a final, silent farewell. The ghost had returned to save the town, but the man behind the legend would not stay. Elias got up, turned his back on the town, and walked toward the horizon. The sun had set, and the stars were beginning to emerge. The legend of Elias Thorne, the blacksmith who became a ghost, would be told for years to come. But as he disappeared into the darkness, it was clear that he had not found redemption in the gun. He had found it in finally accepting his own truth. The days of the Old West may have faded, but in the whispered stories of a quiet man who became a ghost to save a town, the legend lives on. Because sometimes, to protect what's good, you have to face the darkest parts of yourself and realize that a legend isn't about the gun or the victory. A legend is about survival. Legends die harder than bullets.